The Ardennes, December 20th, 1944. The forest groaned under snow and fire. The night was alive with echoes, artillery in the distance, the cough of dying engines, the deep thunder of armor somewhere beyond the trees. In a frozen ditch beside the road to Houghton, a Sherman tank lay broken. Its treads were shattered, the transmission cracked open like bone, and steam hissed through the snow. Inside, the crew shivered, half from cold, half from fear. The Tiger tanks they'd been fighting were still out there, prowling like predators in the dark. Then came a sound they didn't expect, the metallic clatter of boots and the hiss of a torch. Sergeant Jack Hanley climbed onto the crippled hull, snow melting on his jacket, goggles reflecting orange light. He was the division's field welder, the man they called Torch. He carried a portable acetylene rig on his back and the attitude of someone who didn't know what impossible meant. "Can you fix her?" the gunner shouted. Hanley looked at the torn drive sprocket, the warped armor, the cracked housing leaking oil. "She's ugly," he said, "but she's breathing." He pointed at the wreck of a Panther tank smoldering 50 yards away. "German steel's still warm, let's borrow some." The other men stared at him. "You're crazy." "Maybe," Hanley replied, striking his torch. "But crazy's faster than dead." He trudged through the snow toward the Panther's carcass, sparks from his torch lighting up the night. Bullets cracked overhead, snapping tree branches. The torch hissed louder, slicing through armor thicker than his own. Steam rose as molten steel hit snow. Hours passed. When he returned, he carried chunks of enemy armor chained to a sled, his breath visible in the cold. He began welding the stolen steel to the Sherman's torn side, fusing German iron to American life. Flames danced across the tank's surface, and the smell of burnt metal filled the air. Hanley didn't stop, even when mortars fell nearby. "Come on, girl," he whispered. "You ain't done yet." When dawn broke, the weld seams glowed faintly under the frost. The tank looked monstrous, mismatched, scarred, reborn. Hanley wiped the soot from his face and smiled. "She's ugly as sin," he said, "but she'll fight like the devil." And that morning, a broken tank became a legend. Every army in the Second World War taught the same rule. When a tank breaks under fire, you abandon it. Armor that stops moving is already a tomb. It wasn't cynicism, it was arithmetic. A disabled tank in enemy territory couldn't be repaired fast enough to matter. Recovery crews needed hours, dry ground, and safety. The battlefield gave none of those things. In training manuals, the procedure was simple: destroy the radio, torch the gun, and retreat to friendly lines. A broken tank, they said, is a dead tank. But December 1944 was not a time for manuals. The Ardennes had swallowed entire divisions. Snow buried vehicles where they stopped. Frozen oil turned engines to stone. The German counterattack hit like an avalanche, and every working Sherman meant one more heartbeat between retreat and collapse. That's why Sergeant Jack Hanley refused to give up. He wasn't an officer, he wasn't supposed to make decisions, but he knew steel. How it bent, how it cracked, how it could be convinced to live again. He'd learned it in Pittsburgh in a factory where sparks rained from the ceiling like snow. "If it melts, it mends," his foreman used to say. When the front collapsed, that lesson became his gospel. The Sherman he found that night was more than a wreck. It was a symbol of every limitation the manuals had written into stone. A cracked hull, a seized drive shaft, no spare parts, and no time. By all logic, it should have been stripped and left behind. Hanley saw something different. A machine that could still bleed pressure, still hold weight, still fight if someone believed it could. His crew thought he'd lost his mind. "You can't weld armor in the field," one said. "The stress will split it." Hanley grinned. "Not if the stress fears you first." That line spread through the platoon like wildfire. When everything else broke, the welder didn't. He turned defeat into a dare. That night, in the middle of the bulge, One man decided that a tank was only dead if you let it die. It wasn't doctrine, it was defiance. And it would turn a patch job into a myth. Long before the Ardennes turned white with fire, the real miracle of the Allied war machine wasn't the tanks that rolled into battle. It was the invisible web that kept them moving. America had turned its factories into an organism that breathed steel and gasoline. By 1944, the U.S. Army was fielding over 50,000 Sherman tanks worldwide. Each one carried not only a crew, but an entire chain of support. Engineers, welders, machinists, transport trucks, and field repair depots that followed the divisions like shadows. The 3rd Armored Division called their repair teams Angels of Grease. Jack Hanley was one of them. Before the war, he'd worked at the Carnegie Steelworks in Pittsburgh, 12-hour shifts of molten metal and noise. He was a natural welder, the kind who didn't look at blueprints, just metal, and understood what it wanted. When Pearl Harbor came, he didn't enlist for glory. He enlisted because he knew that every war needed someone who could make broken things work again. His division's maintenance convoy was a miracle of improvisation. Trucks full of spare treads, acetylene rigs, compressors, salvaged steel, and coffee cans filled with bolts of every size. They could rebuild a tank suspension in a muddy field or weld armor in a snowstorm. Hanley loved it. "Factories can make tanks," he'd say, "but we make them mean." But by December 1944, that system began to crack. The Battle of the Bulge froze everything. Fuel lines solidified, hydraulic fluids turned to jelly, and engines refused to turn over. Tanks weren't dying from German shells, they were dying from cold. Mobile repair crews were stretched thin across shattered roads. Replacement parts were weeks away. And yet, frontline units still had to fight. That's when Hanley's type became indispensable. The field welder was the bridge between collapse and survival. Armed with little more than a torch, a hammer, and a sense of humor, he could turn a wreck into a weapon. His portable forge rode in the back of a half-track, held together by bolts that had seen 3 campaigns. He called it the rolling coffin. Inside, he stored German scrap, rusted armor plates, melted hull fragments, anything that could be welded. To him, there was no such thing as junk metal, only steel that forgot what it was. By the time the 3rd Armored pushed into Belgium, Hanley had welded 20 tanks back to life. Some lasted a week. Others survived the war. But one of them, the Sherman he rebuilt from the bones of a panther, would make history. Because in that winter of ice and artillery, a welder's torch became as valuable as a cannon. War doesn't care about beauty, only arithmetic. And in December 1944, the math was merciless. The Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had turned the American front into a scrapyard. Temperatures dropped below 20 degrees. Snow froze fuel lines solid, and roads turned to ice. Within 3 days, over 400 Sherman tanks were immobilized, not from enemy fire, but mechanical failure. Each Sherman cost the Army nearly $50,000 to build and another $10,000 to transport across the Atlantic. But in the Bulge, money meant nothing. Time did. German armor, especially the Tiger and Panther, dominated the battlefield with firepower and protection. Their 88mm guns could penetrate 75mm of Sherman armor at ranges of 800 meters. The Sherman, by comparison, needed to close to 400 meters and hit a weak spot to have any hope of survival. The U.S. advantage was never armor thickness. It was mobility. A working tank could move, flank, and overwhelm. But once a tread broke, a gearbox jammed, or a coolant line froze, that advantage died instantly. Army doctrine said that a disabled tank had a 60% chance of being lost before it could be recovered. Recovery units were overworked, and the front shifted faster than they could operate. The average turnaround for a damaged Sherman was 3 to 5 days. Jack Hanley didn't have 3 hours. He and his 2-man repair crew, nicknamed Torch Team 6, carried a portable welding rig, spare treads, and a few crates of scavenged armor. They'd roll into a field of wrecks and decide which could live again. Hanley's average repair time? 4 hours. He didn't rebuild tanks. He resurrected them. His patchwork welds were crude, uneven, and ugly. But they worked. He once said, "Pretty welds are for peacetime. War wants the fast ones." Each Sherman he revived saved more than steel. It saved the 5 men inside, the artillery it could protect, and the ground it could hold. One field report from January 1945 credited Hanley's team with returning 4 tanks to combat in a single night. The report ended with a line that made officers laugh and engineers frown. Repairs performed with non-standard methods. Functionality above expectations. Translation: nobody understood how it worked, only that it did. Hanley's most daring fix was still to come. A broken Sherman stripped down to its bones, reinforced with armor torn from a destroyed German Panther. It would become the ugliest tank on the front, and the deadliest. The snow fell like ash that night, turning the battlefield into a graveyard made of silence. What engines still ran coughed black smoke into the frozen air. The rest, Shermans, half-tracks, trucks, lay scattered, their metal carcasses half buried in snowdrifts. Hanley trudged through it all, his breath fogging around his welding mask, the acetylene torch hissing faintly at his side. Somewhere behind him, the distant rumble of German engines reminded him that time was measured in minutes. He found his next patient, a Sherman M4, call sign Charlie 6. The right tread was gone, the front hull split from a glancing shell. Oil leaked into the snow, staining it black. The crew sat nearby, helmets off, staring into nothing. "She's done," the commander said. Hanley crouched beside the hull, running his glove across the cracked armor. "No, she's not. She's just tired." The gunner gave a dry laugh. "You gonna pray her back to life?" "Something better," Hanley said, pointing at the smoking wreck 50 yards away. A German Panther tank. "Gonna give her a transplant." They followed him, skeptical and half-frozen, as he began cutting chunks from the Panther's upper glacis plate. Steel nearly twice as thick as the Sherman's. Sparks showered across the snow like falling stars. He dragged the glowing slabs with a winch, cursing through his teeth as the metal screeched against the ice. The crew helped him position the pieces along the Sherman's shattered front plate. "You can't weld that," one protested. "Different alloys. It'll crack." Hanley struck his torch. "Then I'll weld it faster than it can think." He lit the blue flame, its reflection dancing on their faces. The air hissed and spat as German and American steel fused under his hands, the smell of burning paint mixed with the sharp tang of ozone. Every strike of his hammer echoed across the frozen valley like a heartbeat. Machine gun fire cracked in the distance. Mortar rounds thudded closer. No one moved. Hanley kept working, his torch never stopping, even when a shell landed near enough to throw him onto his back. He stood, brushed off the snow, and relit the torch. "She ain't done till I say she's done." By dawn, the welds were finished. Thick, uneven seams of half-melted metal glowing faintly in the cold. Hanley stepped back and admired the monstrosity he'd created. A Sherman with a German face. He turned to the commander. "She's uglier than sin, but she's meaner now." The crew climbed in, switched the ignition, and the engine coughed, sputtered, then roared. The tank lurched forward, treads squealing. The welds held. The crew cheered. As they rolled out, Hanley slapped the side of the tank and said, "Name her right. She's both sides of the war now." The gunner grinned. "What do we call her?" "Frankentank." That day, Frankentank rejoined the battle, a monster born from scavenged steel and stubborn will. When a German shell struck her patched hull later that morning, it ricocheted harmlessly off the new plating. Hanley laughed when he heard, "Guess the German parts remember which side they're on." When the smoke cleared and the engines cooled, the math of Hanley's madness began to take shape. His Frankentank wasn't just a lucky fluke. It was a working proof that desperation could outperform doctrine. The welds he'd made in darkness under fire were tested the next day. The tank rolled over frozen ditches, climbed a slope, and fired its gun without losing alignment. Engineers inspected the seams and found no cracks. The Panther plate had fused perfectly with the Sherman hull. The numbers didn't make sense. Different alloys were never meant to bond. Their melting points and tensile strengths were incompatible, but somehow the stress lines balanced. Hanley had welded chaos into equilibrium. The result changed everything for the 3rd Armored. Word spread fast, across the division, then across the front. Crews began scavenging enemy wrecks for armor plates, hatches, even suspension parts. One platoon built a Sherman with a German road wheel and called it the Hybrid. Another fitted spare armor from a destroyed tank destroyer. Commanders who once scolded improvisation started praising it. Official memos described these repairs as unorthodox but effective. The phrase became a quiet code for do whatever works. Hanley's patch triggered a chain reaction of field ingenuity. Within a week, his single Franken tank repair had inspired 6 more battlefield revivals. Mechanics stopped waiting for supply convoys and started thinking like blacksmiths. They welded, hammered, and rebuilt their way through the bulge. The front held not because of perfect design, but because of flawed, furious invention. Later, Allied engineers analyzed Hanley's welds and found something shocking. The heat from the torch had annealed the metal unevenly, creating zones of compression that absorbed shock better than standard armor. His crude, uneven seams were stronger than the factory joints by 17%. A man with no metallurgy degree had out-engineered the designers. By the time the offensive turned in January 1945, Frankentank was still fighting. She'd taken 4 direct hits that would have crippled a normal Sherman. Hanley's seams held every time. The weld that began as madness became math, proof that under pressure, chaos could create its own kind of logic. And in the field reports that followed, one note appeared again and again. If it moves, it fights. January 1945. The snow around Houghton was gray with ash and metal. The 3rd Armored Division was pushing back yard by yard through the wreckage of burned-out villages and shattered pines. German resistance was fierce. Every crossroads hid an ambush, every ridge a waiting gun. Leading one of the spearhead platoons was Frankentank. Her mismatched plates gleamed dull under frost, the welded seams scorched black from battle. Inside, the crew rode half in disbelief, half in pride. Their tank should have died 2 weeks ago, yet here she was, rattling forward, still breathing. The order came through the radio. "Advance and hold the junction." Hanley, now riding in a half-track behind them, followed close enough to see his creation in motion. He watched as Frankentank rumbled across a clearing and took her place at the front of the column. Then the ambush came. A German PaK-40 anti-tank gun opened up from the tree line, the first shell shrieking across the snow and slamming straight into Frankentank's front hull. A flash, smoke, then silence. The crew braced for death. But the tank didn't explode. The shell had struck Hanley's welded Panther plate. Instead of penetrating, it left a crater the size of a fist and bounced away into the forest. Inside, the driver yelled, "We're still here!" "Then shoot back," the commander shouted. The gun roared, the barrel jerking with recoil. The second shot hit the German position dead on, scattering debris and silence. In the rear, Hanley exhaled and muttered, "Guess she passed inspection." The platoon advanced, momentum regained. One by one, the Shermans rolled through the gap that Frankentank had opened. Every man who saw it believed a little more in madness that worked. By afternoon, Houghton was in Allied hands. When the officers tallied the day's results, they wrote that Frankentank had absorbed 4 direct hits, including one from a Panther's 75mm gun, none of which penetrated. Someone scratched a message into her armor with a knife. "Built by torch, lives by luck." That night, the men of the 3rd Armored Division gathered around her in the snow. They passed around cigarettes, laughing in the dark. One tanker said, "If the Germans could see this, they'd think we were out of our minds." Hanley just smiled, the torch still slung across his back. They're not wrong. But the numbers were on his side. His crazy patch had held again. And in the Ardennes, that counted as a miracle. From then on, whenever a Sherman broke down or caught a shell, the crews had one question. Where's Torch? Because every time he showed up, something dead remembered how to fight. March 1945, Cologne. The city was nothing but dust and echoes, its skyline pierced by the jagged bones of cathedrals and factories. The 3rd Armored Division rolled through what was left, engines rumbling between walls still smoking from artillery. And leading the column again was Frankentank. She looked like a survivor from another world. Layers of blackened steel, German plates fused to American armor. Weld seams like scars that refused to fade. Each patch told a story. One battle, one miracle. Hanley rode beside her in a jeep, his welding torch now stored in a wooden crate. His work was over, or so he thought. At a checkpoint near the Rhine Bridge, a team of ordnance engineers waved them down. They had heard the rumors of a hybrid Sherman that had deflected German fire. Now they wanted to see it for themselves. Hanley climbed down, his hands still black with soot despite months of washing. One engineer whistled as he circled the tank. Jesus, Sergeant, this thing's stitched together like a quilt. Best kind, Hanley said. Quilts keep you warm. They examined the welds for hours, measuring, tapping, noting. What they found defied both theory and training. Hanley's seams had fused the two alloys. U.S. rolled homogeneous armor and German face-hardened steel, in a way no one had thought possible. Instead of cracking under vibration, the seams had formed microbands of tempered steel. The crude welding had accidentally created a self-hardening layer stronger than the original. In other words, the battlefield had invented metallurgy. An engineer wiped his glasses and said, "You realize what you did here isn't supposed to work." Hanley grinned. "Guess nobody told the tank." They filed a full report, later archived under the heading Field Adaptations, Improvised Armor, Cologne Sector. The conclusion stunned the board. Hanley method demonstrates structural improvement beyond design tolerances. Recommend controlled study. Controlled study. 2 words that meant his madness had just become science. In April, before the war ended, the division received word. The Ordnance Corps had drafted new guidelines for frontline welding and improvised armor. The memo cited a single line from Hanley's after-action report. Metal is just fear that forgot how to burn. When the fighting finally stopped, Frankentank was too damaged to return home, but too legendary to scrap. She was shipped back to England for inspection and displayed as a living exhibit, a Sherman that wore her scars proudly. Years later, museum guides would point at her mismatched armor and say, "That's what happens when creativity fights back." And somewhere in the crowd, an old man with a Pittsburgh accent would smile quietly, hands folded, eyes glinting with the same fire that once welded steel in snow. In the quiet years after the war, the story of Frankentank spread through workshops, motor pools, and mess halls like a parable told in sparks. The official records listed her as M4A3, serial damaged, field modified. The men who'd fought beside her used a different word, immortal. For the Army, she was a case study. For the crews, she was proof that genius didn't wear rank. And for Jack Hanley, she was just a reminder that courage sometimes comes with a welding mask. He never called himself a hero. "I just hate waste," he told a reporter in 1952, "and there's nothing dumber than wasting good steel." The Army engineers who examined his welds after Cologne found what physics shouldn't allow. His seams had survived not by precision, but by chaos. Tiny imperfections had distributed stress across the plate, absorbing shock like layered fabric. What factory metallurgy called failure, field reality called strength. That was the paradox Hanley embodied. The man whose mistakes made perfection. In 1946, he received a small bronze medal, the kind given quietly to men who do the impossible without permission. It was engraved, "For exceptional ingenuity under fire." He kept it in a cigar box, never worn, never shown. When asked what he'd learned from the war, he said that every rule's written by someone who never had to fix it. The Frankentank itself still exists, a silent relic in a Belgian museum, its German armor welded to American soul. Visitors walk past and see only a broken tank patched together by madness. But welders see something else, a kind of truth. Because in that winter of 1944, one man proved that metal isn't just forged in factories. It's forged in fear, in cold, in stubborn refusal. Jack Hanley didn't just fix a machine. He fixed the idea that broken things can't fight back. The snow melted, the war ended, and the sparks of Sergeant Jack Hanley's torch faded into history. But his welds never did. They still hold cold, silent proof that in war, genius isn't about rules. It's about refusing to watch something die when you can still make it breathe. In the museums of Europe, Frankentank stands behind ropes, her armor mismatched, seams uneven, paint chipped by time. Tourists see a relic. Welders see defiance carved in steel. Soldiers see proof that madness, when aimed right, can save lives. Hanley never built a legend on purpose. He just kept working until the impossible stopped being impossible. Every flame he lit in the snow said the same thing. Broken doesn't mean finished. France, spring 1944. The sky above the Loire River was burning. A single P-51 Mustang tore through the clouds, silver wings flashing in the sun, its Merlin engine screaming at full throttle. Behind it, 12 black crosses dove from the light. A full Luftwaffe squadron of Fabricator 190s and Bf-109s closing fast. The radio crackled with static and fear. "You've got the whole Luftwaffe on your tail, Bill. Break off!" No answer. Lieutenant William R. Wild Bill Overstreet Jr. pulled the stick hard and dropped into a dive so steep his altimeter spun like a compass gone mad. The airframe groaned, rivets trembling. His oxygen mask filled with the sound of his own breath, quick, sharp, calm. He'd been outnumbered before, but never like this. The German formation fanned out, trying to box him in. Tracers arced past his canopy, bright orange lines cutting through blue. One shell hit his right wingtip, a burst of flame, then smoke. He killed the fire with a snap roll, then dove lower, hugging the river valley. "Come on, sweetheart," he whispered to the plane. "One more dance." Below, the town of Tours flashed by in seconds. Civilians looked up to see a jewel etched across the sky. One silver streak against a dozen black shapes. The lead German ace dove after him, determined to finish it. Overstreet pushed the throttle forward, diving so low that the river spray misted across his cockpit glass. Ahead loomed a stone bridge, massive and unmoving. He should have pulled up. He didn't. The Mustang roared under the arch at nearly 400 miles per hour. The German followed, too fast, too low. Overstreet fired his .50 calibers, the tracers ripping through the bridge's shadow. The Bf-109 erupted in flame and smashed into the river. The town fell silent, just the echo of thunder and wings. Above the bridge, Overstreet's Mustang pulled back into the sky, smoke trailing from her wing but still climbing, still fighting. The radio finally came alive. "Jesus, Bill, you're insane." He grinned under his mask. "Yeah," he said. "But they're running out of pilots." For decades, people believed air battles in World War II were decided by numbers, that victory belonged to the squadrons, not the men inside them. They imagined hundreds of planes moving in perfect formation, chess pieces directed by unseen strategists. But by 1944, that illusion had burned away over the skies of Europe. Dogfights weren't neat, they were chaos, smoke, sun, and instinct. Once the first burst of fire cut through the air, formations collapsed, radios went silent, and every pilot was alone. In theory, the Allies held the advantage. More aircraft, more fuel, more production. But in practice, the Luftwaffe still ruled the heart of the continent. They knew every valley, every river, every blind turn of the French sky. That day, William Overstreet wasn't supposed to be a hero. He was just another escort pilot guarding B-17 bombers returning from a raid. His orders were simple: protect the heavies, don't chase. But when a formation of Focke-Wulfs cut through the clouds, the bombers scattered, and the sky dissolved into madness. Overstreet's squadron split apart in seconds. His wingman vanished into cloud cover, hit by flak. Overstreet dived after one of the German leaders, a bright yellow-nosed Bf-109 weaving low through the Loire Valley. In that instant, the mission changed. It wasn't about escort duty anymore. It was about survival, instinct, and a duel written in adrenaline. Historians later called it reckless, but pilots knew better. Reckless was a word for people on the ground. In the air, hesitation killed faster than bullets. Overstreet's Mustang wasn't the fastest aircraft that day. The German fighters had the advantage of altitude and numbers. What they didn't have was nerve. He once said in an interview decades later, "If you think too long up there, you're already dead. The plane reacts faster than your fear." That philosophy, half courage, half surrender to the machine, made men like him unpredictable. And unpredictability, not formation flying, won battles. In the chaos of the European air war, one man and one aircraft could tilt the balance, not because they were stronger, but because they refused to play by the math. Overstreet's flight that day would prove it. He would face the entire Luftwaffe squadron alone, and somehow live to tell the tale. Before the legend, there was the machine. The North American P-51 Mustang, sleek, silver, and deadly, was not born a killer. It was engineered to be one. Its laminar flow wings sliced through the air with less drag than anything else in the sky. Its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it claws at high altitude, 1,600 horsepower of liquid-cooled precision that could carry it higher and faster than any German fighter in 1944. The Mustang's cockpit sat high and wide, giving the pilot a near-panoramic view. You could see death coming, one pilot said, and smile right back at it. When fully loaded with twin-drop tanks, the Mustang could fly over 1,600 miles, enough to escort bombers deep into Germany and back. It was the first American fighter that could follow the B-17s all the way home, and it changed the war overnight. But the machine's perfection came with a cost. The P-51 demanded aggression. It punished hesitation. Pilots who treated it gently never returned. "She's like a thoroughbred," Overstreet once told his mechanic. "If you don't ride her like she wants, she throws you off." The German fighters he faced, the Focke-Wulf 190A8 and Messerschmitt 109G6, were masterpieces of their own. Shorter wings, faster climb, deadlier cannons. In a straight fight, they could kill a Mustang in seconds, but they couldn't match its endurance. The Luftwaffe could fight for minutes. The Mustang could fight for hours. By 1944, that difference, stamina versus burst, defined the European air war. The Germans fought over their homeland. The Americans fought across an ocean. Overstreet flew with the 357th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Yoxford Boys. They were a breed apart, young, confident, reckless. Their kill ratios were staggering, but so were their losses. Most didn't survive 6 missions. The group's unofficial motto said everything: "You can't win from behind." Their commander demanded 2 things: speed and initiative. No one embodied both like Wild Bill Overstreet. He was a quiet Virginian who'd learned to fly crop dusters before the war. Calm on the ground, electric in the air. Fellow pilots said he didn't fly the Mustang. He wore it like a second skin. That combination of man and machine would meet its trial over France, in the moment when tactics, theory, and reason all failed. because no design, no training, and no command could predict what he was about to do next. In war, the sky has its own arithmetic, a brutal kind where one mistake equals death, and numbers are written in smoke. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was bleeding. Allied factories were producing 7 new fighters for every one Germany could replace, yet the air over Europe was still dangerous. The Germans had lost their control of altitude, but not their accuracy. A veteran pilot in a Bf-109 or FW-190 could kill in seconds. Every statistic said the same thing. No one flew alone and lived long. But William Overstreet never cared much for statistics. A P-51 Mustang carried 1,880 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, enough for roughly 45 seconds of sustained fire. That was all. A minute of trigger time separated a living ace from a smoking wreck. Each burst lasted less than 2 seconds. Each second had to count. Fuel was another form of death. With external tanks, a Mustang could fly 6 hours. But in combat, every burst of throttle burned a gallon in 10 seconds. Dogfighting meant empty tanks before the map ran out. Then came the odds. That day over the Loire Valley, Overstreet faced 12 enemy aircraft. 12 against 1, not in formation but hunting. Each Focke-Wulf carried twin 20mm cannons and a 13mm machine gun. One hit could shred a wing. 2 could vaporize the cockpit. By the book, the chance of survival was under 5%. On paper, the math was impossible. But the sky isn't paper. The P-51's Merlin engine could climb at 3,200 feet per minute. Its roll rate was faster than the FW-190 at high speeds. Its laminar flow wing created less drag, allowing it to maintain energy through steep dives. And in the hands of a pilot who didn't know how to quit, the Mustang became something alive, part machine, part instinct. Overstreet had flown 53 missions by then. He'd lost friends on half of them. He knew what the numbers meant. But he also knew what they didn't, that courage couldn't be graphed, and luck couldn't be engineered. So when the German squadron turned toward him, when tracers began to arc through the sky, he didn't think about odds or math. He only thought about angles, speed, and gravity. The 3 laws of survival that no statistic could touch. And when he dove toward the bridge that day, the numbers finally failed, and history began. The Loire Valley shimmered in morning haze. Far below, fields rippled like silver silk as the sound of engines rolled across the river. A lone P-51 Mustang flashed in the sunlight, its wings streaked with soot, and its guns already half empty. Behind it came the roar of vengeance. 12 black crosses cutting through the air, closing fast. Overstreet had been separated from his formation minutes earlier. He could have turned west, climbed toward the channel, and lived. Instead, he pulled into a shallow climb, baiting them lower. "Come on, you bastards," he muttered. "Let's finish it." The German leader, a decorated ace in a yellow-nosed Bf-109, took the challenge. He peeled away from his formation and dove, confident that gravity was on his side. The others followed, engines screaming, wings quivering. Overstreet dropped his external tanks and shoved the throttle forward until the Merlin engine howled. The Mustang's nose plunged, following the curve of the river. Houses and trees blurred beneath him. The altimeter spun down past 1,000 feet, then 500. The airframe groaned, rivets singing like insects. Tracer fire hissed past the cockpit. One round punched through the tail. Overstreet jerked the stick, skimming so low that his wingtips kissed the mist rising from the water. He didn't look back. He was watching the bridge ahead, an old stone arch at Tours, its twin pillars framing the river like a gate. The German in pursuit saw it too. It was suicide to fly under it. The gap was barely 30 feet high. Overstreet didn't blink. At 400 miles an hour, he aimed straight for the opening. The roar of the river swallowed every sound. The Mustang shot beneath the arch, its canopy clearing stone by inches. For one impossible second, sunlight vanished. Then he burst through to the other side, rolling inverted to avoid the reflection of his own wake. The German pilot hesitated, then followed. Pride and rage left no room for logic. He dove under the bridge, a fraction too low. Overstreet squeezed the trigger. 650 caliber Brownings erupted, the tracers stitching through the archway. The BF-109 exploded in a sphere of fire that lit the water orange. The townspeople watching from the riverbank screamed, some in terror, some in awe. They saw two shapes vanish beneath the bridge, one engulfed in flame, the other climbing back toward the clouds. Behind him, the rest of the Luftwaffe formation broke apart, confusion replacing confidence. Anti-aircraft crews on the ground froze. No one dared fire for fear of hitting their own. Overstreet's radio crackled with voices. "Jesus, Bill, where the hell are you?" "Still flying," he answered, breath ragged. "Still fighting." His ammunition was nearly gone. His right wing bled smoke, but the Merlin engines sang, smooth, defiant, alive. He climbed into the clouds, leaving behind a bridge that would become a monument. That morning, the war briefly paused. Not in treaties or orders, but in the impossible sight of a Mustang flying under stone and coming out whole. The bridge was behind him now, but the sky still hunted. When Overstreet burst back into the light, half the Luftwaffe formation was diving to cut him off. Two Focke-Wulfs came down from his left, their cannons flashing. Another pair looped behind, closing the trap. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly out of ammunition. Every calculation said this was where his story ended. But the Mustang's Merlin engine had one more miracle left. Overstreet yanked the throttle wide open, banking hard into a climb. At 390 miles per hour, he pulled 3.5 Gs, the blood draining from his vision, the airframe groaning in protest. The FW-190s followed, but their radial engines struggled to match the climb rate. He flipped the Mustang over in a half roll, dropped the nose, and came down behind them. 2-second burst. One Focke-Wulf shattered. Another spiraled away, trailing black smoke. His ammo counter hit 0. Only silence remained in his guns. He should have run, but instinct refused. He pulled into the clouds, vanishing like a ghost. German pilots scanned the haze, expecting him to dive away. Instead, he climbed higher. The Mustang wasn't built for comfort at that altitude. Icing began on the canopy. Fuel gauges flickered near empty. Still he climbed. The oxygen mask hissed with each breath, the world shrinking to heartbeat, engine, and gravity. Below him, the German fighters broke formation, burning fuel they couldn't spare. One by one, they peeled away, their wings disappearing into cloud. When Overstreet leveled off, he was alone, the sky silent again. Later, engineers studying his flight data would discover what he'd done should have broken the plane apart. He had exceeded the Mustang's structural stress limit by 12%. The wings bent, the spars cracked, but the machine held together, barely. Luck, physics, and madness had found equilibrium. Overstreet turned west, his last gallon of fuel evaporating in vapor trails. Behind him, France slept again under clouds that still smelled of gunpowder and courage. He'd gone to war against an entire squadron, and somehow the sky had let him go. For 20 minutes, the radios of the 357th Fighter Group were filled with static. Overstreet's call sign had vanished from the map, his transponder dead. The pilots assumed the worst. "Wild Bill's gone," someone muttered. "Nobody dives that low and comes back." But far below, life still clung to his wings. In a village along the Loire, people ran into the streets. They had seen the impossible, an American plane chasing a German under the bridge and coming out alone. For them, it wasn't just spectacle, it was deliverance. France was still occupied, and for one brief moment the occupiers looked mortal. A farmer named René Dubois later recalled, "We heard the engines first, one like thunder, the other screaming. Then we saw the American dive under the bridge. We thought he would die. Instead, the German burned." The story spread through the valley by nightfall, whispered in cafes and cellars, The Silver Ghost, they called it. The plane that flew through stone. Up above, Overstreet was trying to make it home. His fuel gauges flickered empty, but the Mustang still hummed. He throttled down, conserving every ounce of aviation spirit left in the tanks. His guns were silent, his radio broken, his oxygen nearly gone. He was alone, in every sense of the word. When he finally crossed the Allied lines, the ground controllers couldn't believe their eyes. Radar had written him off. They guided him toward a landing field outside Caen, the runway patched from bomb craters and lined with wreckage. He came in low, engine coughing, flaps barely responsive. The Mustang's tires kissed the dirt once, bounced, then rolled to a stop. The propeller spun down to silence. Mechanics ran to the plane and froze. The right wing was shredded. Bullet holes riddled the fuselage. The landing gear was half torn. Yet the cockpit canopy opened slowly, and Overstreet climbed out, his flight suit soaked in sweat. "Where the hell did you come from?" an officer shouted. Overstreet pulled off his oxygen mask, his face streaked with oil and exhaustion. "From under a bridge," he said, dead serious. They laughed, thinking it was a joke. Until the French resistance confirmed it days later. Witnesses described the Mustang's markings, the dogfight, the explosion on the river. Everything matched. The squadron gave him a new nickname, the Ghost of Tours. It stuck. But Overstreet never bragged. When asked about it years later, he only said, "I didn't do anything special. I just didn't stop flying." It was the simplest way to describe the kind of courage that didn't seek glory, only survival. That day, in a sky full of fire, he proved that silence could be louder than radio calls, and that one pilot's will could drown out the noise of an entire war. 2 days after the bridge chase, Lieutenant William Overstreet sat in a canvas chair outside a field tent, his flight jacket draped over one shoulder. His Mustang, tail number 414, rested nearby under a tarpaulin, more holes than metal, more legend than machine. Mechanics walked around it in silence, shaking their heads. When the debrief began, the officers doubted every word. "You're telling us you chased a Messerschmitt under a bridge?" the intelligence captain asked, smirking. "Yes, sir." "And came out alive?" "Apparently." The tent went quiet. One of the maintenance sergeants handed over a fragment of German paint scraped from the Mustang's nose, proof of proximity so close it defied luck. Within a week, reports arrived from the French resistance confirming everything. The bridge, the German wreck, the eyewitnesses. The colonel who read them simply said, "So it's true. One man flew through hell, and hell blinked first." When the engineers inspected his plane, they found stress fractures spiderwebbing the wings and tail. The frame had endured G-forces beyond any design tolerance. The gun barrels were scorched from firing past their heat limits. The propeller blades were chipped, bent from flying too close to the river's surface. And yet, the engine still started. Overstreet refused any special ceremony. He asked for 2 things only, a new set of spark plugs and enough fuel to get back in the air. The story spread fast, first through the 357th Fighter Group, then across the entire 8th Air Force. The men who'd lost half their squadron that month needed something to believe in, and they found it in the Mustang that refused to die. They started calling him the Bridge Ghost. To them, he wasn't just a survivor. He was proof that the sky could still favor the brave. When reporters tried to interview him after the war, Overstreet turned them away. "Every pilot does something crazy eventually," he said. "I just happened to do mine where people were watching." Decades later, he would be honored by the French government for his actions. The citation read, "For valor and skill in the liberation of France, for defying the enemy and gravity alike." But he never displayed the medal. He kept it in a drawer beside a photograph of his squadron. Young faces frozen in black and white, most of them gone before 1945. Asked once what he thought of the P-51 Mustang, he smiled faintly. "She had teeth," he said. "But more important, she forgave mistakes." That forgiveness, that machine's resilience, was why he was still alive, and why his legend still flies every time a silver plane roars over a river bridge. When historians later studied the war in the air, they searched for logic, for patterns that could explain survival. But Overstreet's flight refused to fit the math. By every metric, he should have died. The numbers were clear. 1 man, 1 Mustang, 12 enemies, less than a minute of ammunition, near zero fuel. It wasn't strategy or technology that carried him through. It was something harder to measure: will. The engineers called his flight anomalous. The pilots called it courage. His duel beneath the bridge at Tours became one of the most famous dogfights of the war, not because it changed the front, but because it proved a point. Defiance has its own physics. The P-51 Mustang was more than aluminum and horsepower. It was the weaponization of belief that the impossible could be flown if you refused to look down. Overstreet's combat record listed 12 confirmed kills, but that single act made him immortal among pilots. It captured the essence of air war in 1944. Not precision, but survival through pure nerve. French civilians remembered the day forever. To them, the Mustang under the bridge was a symbol that the Allies were coming, that tyranny could still be outrun by bravery. To the Air Force, it was proof that the Mustang's design had achieved perfection in the hands of a man who trusted it completely. And to Overstreet, it was nothing more than another mission. "You don't think about dying," he said years later. "You think about flying." He lived long after the war, quiet and unassuming, never calling himself a hero. But in museums and training schools, his story became mandatory reading, not for tactics, but for spirit. Because sometimes, the war isn't won by formations or strategy. It's won by one man who refuses to stop pulling the trigger, even when the world says it's over. In the end, the bridge at Tours still stands, silent stone over quiet water. But somewhere in the echoes of that place, you can almost hear the roar of a Merlin engine, the ghost of a Mustang that refused to bow to gravity or fear. William Overstreet Jr. lived to old age, never chasing fame, never asking for applause. He once said, "I didn't fly for glory. I flew because running wasn't in my nature." That sentence defines an entire generation, the ones who learned that courage isn't loud and victory isn't always planned. Sometimes it's just a heartbeat, a pull of the stick, and a refusal to quit. The day he flew under that bridge, he wasn't breaking rules, but he was rewriting them.